Hello and welcome everyone to this video in which I will go over the scout units that are available in Mainline Battle for Wesnoth, their strengths, their weaknesses and what I think of them. Take this video as a quick overview over those units to give you more of an idea what they can all do. We will start with the loyalists here to the side, which would be the cavalry line. I personally really love this line. And in terms of fighting strength, they are probably among, if not the strongest that exists for scouts. As you can see, they have an actual 10-4 melee attack and a 21, as in 20 hit for one hit crossbow in ranged, which is for a scout unit really strong. And scrolling a bit down to their resistances, they actually have a lot of resistances, especially for a scout unit. Of course, the usual negative pierce resistance because they're a mounted unit. And of course, as you can see, extremely bad defense ratings, especially because on forest and fungus their defense capped. Now, you might ask, is this unit just the best among scouts units? And sadly, despite how cool they are, I would say that they are probably among the worst scouts units. If you purely look at them in terms of scouts. That is mainly because movement-wise, they actually cap out at 9. Which, little spoiler alert, most faction scouts go to 10 or maybe even 11. Or have other advantages that make up for it. And not only is their movement capped at 9, but they also have the unfortunate disadvantage that on most Tyrant types that are not really just flat or castle, they need at least 2 movement points or even 3, like in the forest. And that brings us over to the Elvish Scout line. In itself, you would think that they're worse than the cavalry line that we just went through. Their melee attack isn't as strong, their ranged attack is a bit stronger, but they're also lacking the resistances. But they have 2 big advantages. For one, once they go up to level 2, with the Elvish Rider, they actually gain 10 movement points. Or 11 if they get quick. Same for the cavalrymen, by the way. If you manage to spawn a unit with the quick trait, you can actually get them to 10 movement points. But the big advantage that the Elven Outrider has, aside of course from its 1 base movement point more, is its movement point costs. They're elves, so as you can imagine, they are a lot more mobile in forests. In fact, they only take 1 movement point in them. And not only that, this unit has way better defense ratings. Going over to the orcs, or in this case of course the goblin wolf riders, we actually have a special case of a scout unit having 2 different promotions. The base unit, as you can see, is, well, nothing special. It does a job, but honestly there's nothing really all that special to it. It has a weak melee attack, it doesn't have resistances, but it also doesn't have weaknesses, and it has a fairly good movement cost on most terrain types. If it levels up, however, it can actually go into a prestige unit, which I think is the only scout unit that is capable of doing so. And in doing so, it will become a goblin pillager, which I must admit is pretty much the only prestige unit I ever go for, me being mostly a campaign player, because not only does it get a fire attack, and it's always nice to have a fire attack, it actually gets a slowing ranged attack, and slows are just wonderful. They halve the opponent's movement range and halve their damage. The utility of that unit is simply incredible, especially if you consider that its movement also goes up to 9. Which would be the same with the Goblin Knight, who in itself is clearly a worse alternative to the Goblin Pillager. Sure, it has a bit more melee damage, but you're really not looking to win a actual melee fight with a scout unit. At most you will be picking off weak stragglers. But that's not what you get a Goblin Knight for. You get it so you can get yourself a Dire Wolf Rider, which is, of course, in the end the best option. Not only does it actually become strong enough to put out a proper fight, but its movement range also goes up to 10, and movement is the absolute most important thing you want to have with a scout unit. Then we switch over to the dwarves, who actually have a unit that can only go up to level 2, but that is also very important for their balance, because not only does their movement instantly go from 8 to 10 movement, but they are flying unit, and as you can therefore imagine, their movement ability is absolutely broken. They can cross almost every terrain type with just one movement, and the few that they can't is mostly in caves. Added to that, their defense rating on most stuff is actually pretty high, with 50% in almost everything except once again caves. But if they have to fight, they even have a pretty strong melee attack, but well, they're not meant to fight, and most use them to pick off a few weak stragglers, I'd say. Now, the undead, not really the first faction you think of if you think about scout units, but well, they have the bad unit, which at first you might think, only 8 to 9 move, is that really enough? And well, yes it is, because just like the Griffin Rider, they are flying unit and they have movement cost of 1 essentially everywhere. They even get it in caves. The only thing they don't have it on is fungus, but it's not like you often will have to cross a lot of fungus. And not only that, but in contrast to the 50% of the Griffin Riders, those tiny little friends get 60% of everything. They are an absolute pain to hit, and what makes it even worse, they actually have a draining melee attack. They have very little HP and instantly melt if they meet a mage or a marksman unit, but if they don't, they can be an absolute pain in the neck for stragglers or, well, even for some stronger units, since they're so hard to hit and actually drain back a lot of their health if they don't take too much damage. But they should still never really be sent against level 3 units or more stronger level 2 units. Then we go over to the Drakes, which is a race that I haven't actually used that much, because they don't really have mainline campaigns. We will apparently soon get a mainline campaign again, and they have a bunch of add-on campaigns, but I just haven't gotten that much experience with them yet. However, their scout unit also looks very solid, once again due to the fact that they're a flying unit and therefore have amazing mobility in everything that's not a cave. They add to that they are actually passable fighting unit, mostly because if we look through this promotions here, the entire line has a marksman ability, so even if their ranged attack isn't the strongest, it is still fairly accurate, so that gives them a fairly good reliability to actually finish off weakened units. And well, like all Drake units, their resistances are a bit lopsided. Obviously fire isn't going to do much to them, but well, both Cold and Pierce is good at taking them out, and they are of course arcane weak. But I would still say a very solid scout unit, especially with their mixed damage, where they can put up at least a small fight against anything that will try to hurt them. Now, lastly we have the Dune Folk, which I admit I have essentially not played at all. But I will give my best guesses. What I find unique about their scout is that it actually is the same base unit as for their more combat focused cavalry units, that being the Dune Rider. If that gets upgraded to do the Dune Raider and then the Dune Marauder, they get the highest movement range unit, with a movement range of 9, who can hold its own both in melee and in range combat, but it doesn't really excel in either. It also has another thing that is actually fairly rare for a Dune unit, as far as I'm aware. The unit is neither liminal or lawful, which most of the faction are. As you can see, the moment you change into Raider, it becomes a chaotic unit. So that gives the unit a bit more tactical variety, because you can actually use it for certain offensive actions, because with the Dune Folk you usually expect them to attack during dawn, dusk or the day, since most of your units are focused on that. So you have a bit more variety what you can do there. As a scout unit I would say it's rather middling, kind of the same problem as a cavalryman, maybe even a bit more pronounced. It doesn't really have a pure focus on scouting. But it's the best they have in terms of movement range, so if you want a unit to quickly cap villages that are on the edge of the map, or just general scouts, they are still the best choice that you have. They actually have fairly good defenses. Of course, the mounted unit Pierce negative is always there, but they fare fairly well against Arcane, like most of the Dune Folk, and also have resistances against Blade and Impact. Also, just like the cavalry units, their movement costs on many terrains are sadly not the best. Now, In itself, those were the 7 main factions, but as you might have already spotted, I actually spawned in a few more units down here. I want to talk about 2 special human cases. The first being the Lancer. Despite not being the scout unit, this wonderful unit actually has the highest movement speed in terms of what humans get. They are the prestige class up of the Horseman. The normal class up would be the Knight, a unit that also only has 8 movement. But if you instead go for the Lancer, you get this absolute, well, torpedo of a 10 movement unit with a 12-3 charge attack. Now, they obviously are meant for picking off certain units, but if you really desperately need all the movement range you can get, they are actually your best choice. They have a movement range of 10 as opposed to the cavalry's 9, and if you get them quick it even goes up to 11. And as you can see, their movement modifiers are essentially the same as for the scout unit. I would not necessarily recommend using them in that role, but if you do it, you have a scout that not only has a really high movement range, like as you can see, it can easily cross all the way over to here, but it can also hold its own. Though, like you probably are aware with that unit, it also can very quickly kill itself if its charge fails. And lastly, I here have the fugitive line. They, well, at first seem to have a quite low movement range, only being 7 and going up to, well, actually staying at 7. Most of those units actually happen to be spawning with the quick modifier. But, in certain cases, they are the best scout you have access to. They are not the fastest, and they don't actually have as good movement costs as some flying units, but especially if you have very forested maps or very hilly maps, they are actually a better choice for you than your cavalry. Now, it all depends, of course, what unit list you have available too. I know in the multiplayer the Knalgen Alliance gets the Outlaws, but there are quite a few human campaigns where the Outlaws get added to your unit list. Take Rise of Wesnoth, for example, and you can also get a few in that one choice mission on the island in Heir to the Swarm, and of course Liberty. So there are quite a few campaigns where you have access to them. So, especially in campaigns where you have to decide between the footpads, outlaws, the entire line, or the cavalrymen, I would say it's mostly down to which map type you're facing and also which enemy type. Cavalrymen obviously are one of the best against undead units, or like I already said, in hilly terrain, while fugitives are quite good in such scenarios, because while it's not 1, they still have at least only a movement cost of 2 in such areas, so they can actually outpace the cavalrymen there. And because their entire attack set is impact focused, they actually do quite good against the skelly boys of the undead. What they do not deal well with, of course, are, well, usually other loyalist units, because like all outlaws, they just get huge minus on defense against blade, impact and pierce weapons. And they can also be quite, well, they don't really last long against magic or marksman units, because they are very reliant on their very, very high defenses to stay alive. That is the other advantage that they get. They have the highest defenses you can really get with the scout unit, bearing of course the elven scout specifically on... Oh no, I was actually mistaken. Even the Elven Scout only gets 60% on grassy terrain. So the footpad is a wonderful choice if you, well, like a dodge tank unit, because they have actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 different terrain types in which they can get a 70% defense, which is extremely high, especially for a scout unit. Well, and that would be all the scout units that are in the mainline campaign. If asked which my favorite would be, I would actually still say the cavalrymen. Yes, they don't really fulfill the job as a scout as good as some other units, but I absolutely love their armored look, especially their portrait is wonderful. And even if they don't do the job that well, I just love just how hard they can still hit despite being a scout. Well, if I had to say which I think is the best scout unit, I would probably actually go with the Bat, because in terms of sheer movement, they are absolutely wonderful. Sure, on open maps, the Griffin Rider and Griffin Master especially will defeat them, But with the beds, it doesn't matter what map you are. Cave maps are usually especially bad in terms of, well, actually scouting them out. So with the bed, you just have instant access to, well, most of a cave map even, which the Griffin simply can't do because with their movement cost of 3 in a cave map, they will be cut down to 3 or 4 movement per turn. So, yeah, they are quite hampered in that aspect. Well, I hope you at least somewhat enjoyed that video and have a wonderful day.